at long last, because this is lesson, I think by the count is 19, and this is Daniel chapter 12. And I will tell you, it feels a little artificial to have a chapter 12 here, because to have a 12 verse 1, because we're we're continuing the thought. There isn't any real break in content between the end of chapter 11, where we finished last time, and chapter 12. We're continuing with the revelation to Daniel from Gabriel this week, as we were in last week. In fact, you could literally speak of this as being very parallel for the Old Testament people of God, people of faith, as what the revelation of John was in the first century to persecuted Christians in those days. Revelation of John, New Testament; revelation of Daniel, Old Testament. A lot the same kind of literature, a lot the same kind of content there. And this last bit, in fact, chapter 12, is going to sound a lot more like Revelation than it does Daniel. In fact, you wouldn't necessarily know we were still in Daniel, except that in the end there is a pointed little exhortation that Gabriel gives the old man in verses 9 through 13. So the theme, I think, good one for overall for this chapter is hang on till the end. Hang in there till the end, I should say. So the encouragement is there will be an end, right? There will be an end to tough times, to hard times, and there will be victory to celebrate in the end. Okay. Like I said, lots of parallel sounding stuff in Daniel 12 to Revelation. Now, reviewing back a little bit of what I said on the end of chapter 11 about the fact that we still don't know for certain, never will, the exact identity of the person discussed in verses 36 through 45, be it a representative picture, kind of composite picture of Rome, which I believe it is, or of the Antichrist who's to come, or who exactly. But scholars are pretty sure the specific facts don't describe Antiochus IV Epiphanes anymore after verse 36. He did not invade or conquer many countries, as verse 41 says of this person, 11 verse 41, nor did he gain control of the riches of Egypt, nor did he have the Libyans and the Cushites, which is another name for Ethiopians. He didn't have them submit to him. That never happened in regards to Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Okay, he was a very much regional power. So he was limited in his scope and range of power and reign. By the way, and I'd never even thought of this one, Jim McGuigan, boy, he spends about 5 pages debunking who this is not in chapter 11, 36 through 40. I thought he spent way too much time on that, but he brought up Herod the Great. I never even thought about it being Herod the Great. Well, Herod the Great didn't accomplish all that stuff either. So it couldn't be Herod the Great either. But he goes through about who all it couldn't be. Mormon, I think he lands on that it's Rome too, but he never really. He puts a lot more effort into saying who it's not. So here's what it boils down to. Okay, get this thing go. Here's why it doesn't matter. That's what you care about, right? Here's why it doesn't matter who it is for the sake of Daniel's audience. It doesn't matter who it is because the point of verse 36 and the end of verse 45 are still the same regardless. And if you've forgotten what those said, look back there real quickly. He will be successful, this is the end of 36, until the time the wrath is completed, for what's been determined must take place. Then at the end of 45, it says, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So, there's the story. Now, what is the similarity between the person, the entity, whomever it is we're talking about in 36 through 45? What's the similarity between that person or representative picture and what John is given to tell us in Revelation about Satan? I think there's a lot of similarities. Now, okay. Well, the scope is, there is power if you're within range of that power, but the power, on the other hand, is limited, right? In scope, in intensity, in several different ways. So that's it. Got to work on this. The power is limited. The scope is limited. He will meet his end. It's already a done deal. Can't we rejoice in that? It looks on a lot of days like Satan has the upper hand, doesn't it? And seems like in our age, more often than not, it feels like Satan is winning the day. But God says through his prophets and through folks like John, hold on. Hang in there till the end, because the end of the story hadn't come yet. We're waiting for the time when God's going to bring all this to completion, when his purpose is going to be fulfilled, and he's going to bring the end. So this is what we as Christians need to hear, right? This is what faithful in Daniel's day and his later audiences that were going to be going through all this stuff up till the time of Christ's coming, this is what they needed to hear. Keep the faith. Hang in there. God's still working. And the overall message, remember, of Daniel still is in play here. We've said it almost every time, that God is in control and that his purposes are going to be fulfilled in the end. Okay? God is ultimately in control. God is sovereign. Okay. Whoever is depicted at the end of chapter 11. They're limited, so it's very similar to Revelation of John chapter 20. If you want to look over there, I just wanted to skim a couple of things because I think it's significant. And it helps me once in a while to run over some of this. Maybe it helps you. Early in that chapter, it talks about the angel has a great chain. He sees the dragon, the ancient serpent, who's the devil or Satan. He wants to make sure we know who this is, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss, locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore till the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. A couple more references. Verse 6, I believe it is. It's very hard for me to read with my contact in, so sorry. Blessed and holy are those who have part in the first resurrection. The second death has no more power over them. They'll be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him 1,000 years. There at the end, verse 10, into this passage. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and false prophet had been thrown. They'll be tormented day and night forever and ever. The end. Yoo-hoo, right. That's it. That's what we're looking forward to, right? Is that being a reality for us. So, I think of Satan, when I read those words, and I think of what's depicted to come to God's faithful people in Daniel 12, I think of I think of Satan as a kind of a mean dog. You know, think of the meanest breed of dog you've ever seen. And he's on a chain. His bite's powerful, it's deadly if you get within range, right? He has power if you're close enough. But if you make the right choices, he's not going to affect you, right? If you stay out of range of him, you're protected by God, by the Father. He's limited in reach, and one day he's going to be done away with forever for the punishment that he has inflicted on so many. In the meantime, the faithful have to stay strong in the face of some of the damage he can do. So, note the similarities in chapter 12. There's mention of a reward for the righteous. There's mention of a book. We'll get to that in a moment. There's mention of suffering of the saints, verse 10, so forth. There are also, and I'd urge you to turn over there for just a moment, there are also similarities in Matthew 24 to Daniel chapter 12. Now, why would I say that? Because it's the same kind of literature, right? We're talking about apocalyptic literature. This in Mark 13 is what's called Jesus' little apocalypse. And just like when Jesus is talking about two different ends here, one is going to come closer to his time, and one he's talking about the very end, right? The same as in Daniel 12. There's some stuff that's going to happen closer, and then there's some stuff that's projected that's going to happen at the end. Matthew 24, of course, in verses 4 through, I'm reading it right, verse 25, basically, is talking about what was going to happen in AD 70 when Titus was going to sack Rome. By the way, there's going to be another, what is considered to be another thing that happened with Antiochus. Not exactly the same, but another desecration of a temple, right? Committed this time by the Roman emperor, the Roman general. And so that's in verse 4 through 25. That's what's coming in the not too distant future, AD 70. Then he starts talking about in verse 26 through the end of chapter 24, he starts talking about you've got to get ready for the real end, right? When the Lord comes again. So he's talking about second coming stuff then. Most of that. Now there may be actually a little bit mixed in there. But a great deal of that is talking about Jesus' second coming. So, I think it's instructive for us of what's going on here in Daniel chapter 12. In 12, we have this kind of back and forth between, near and far. What's going to happen to God's faithful in Antiochus' day. And I know I said we stopped talking about him before verse 36, but a lot of folks we read say that 12 verse 11, it's a reference to what Antiochus would later do in the temple. Whenever you read that, abomination that causes desolation, that's Antiochus' work talking there, how he interrupted the temple worship with the weird altar to the Greek form of Zeus there, and the sacrifice of the pig's blood and all that, spill the pig's blood on the altar and all that stuff. So, although, an alternate is that could be referring to that second desolation, the one after Antiochus, which was the Roman one. So some of this is still kind of up in the air, okay? But that's the nature of this kind of writing, I think. Some of this just not going to solve this side of asking God about it. And as I always say, when we get there, we're not going to care. You know, we have our list of questions we want to ask, but we're going to be so wowed by where we are and in whose presence we are, those questions aren't going to matter anymore. That's my thought. Now, if you want to hold on to some questions, that's up to you. But I think they're not going to be a big deal. All the things we wonder about now, it's either going to be answered sufficiently by being there, or we're not going to care because of what we're experiencing, right? So it doesn't matter. Verses 1b and 2 here in chapter 12 deal with what will happen at the end for all mankind. It is the most detailed prophecy of the resurrection. I'll say more about this in a moment, that we have in the Old Testament, because it's the first and only one that depicts the end for both the righteous and the unrighteous. Were you aware of that? The only one, at least up to this point in the Old Testament, that depicts the end for both the righteous and the unrighteous. There where he says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. That's an interesting way of talking about the end for the unrighteous, isn't it? To everlasting contempt.
I was in my 40s or 50s, I think, before someone pointed out to me, and I said, no, you're not right, but afterwards I think maybe they were, that the Jews, to a large extent, didn't really believe in the afterlife the way we do. No. We just assume everybody has heaven and hell, same concept ever since, Genesis.
You're right.
But the Sadducees, they didn't believe in resurrection at all. And of course, comparing the Jews of today is probably not a good parallel, but there's a lot of God-fearing Jews today that also don't believe in it. It's kind of like you have, the world, you get your rewards here almost, and then it's not like they just don't share the same concept of afterlife that we do.
No, they do not. And in fact,
in the Old Testament, that's why. But it sort of is like what you just pointed out. There's to it anyway.
But notice how late that reference comes. It was not an established. It was not a built-up doctrine. Now we get little hints, I think, like Psalm 23. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What does he mean by that? Is that talking about the afterlife? Kind of sounds like it, right? There's a note also from David in 2 Samuel 12, I believe it's 12. It's after the Bathsheba incident, where their illegitimate child, is about to die, or has died, sorry, and he says, he can't come to me, I'll go to him. Well, what does that mean? That means there was a thought there, at least, about the afterlife, right? Some experience on the other side, that he believed he would see that son, and I believe he will. So that the son's going to be there. He wasn't a sinner, he was just a victim of circumstance, of sin of his mother and father. So anyway, but yeah, I think whoever's telling you that was right. Until the intertestamental period, that's really where it began. With the rise of the Pharisees, there began to be a more fleshed out doctrine of the resurrection. And so that's why, Paul played on that. Remember in Acts, in the council, he played the Sadducees against the Pharisees by saying, I'm here on account of the resurrection, right? And so they went after it because the Sadducees didn't believe in that still, as Charles said, and the Pharisees very much did. And so you got to give it to Paul. He knew how to get an argument going, you know. Kind of like when somebody who's in trouble gets two parties that brought them in to fighting each other, and then they can quietly slip out. It didn't exactly work that way for Paul, but anyway, I always laugh at that, what he did there. Okay. Now a little more detail about chapter 12 that we really haven't gotten into yet. I like the outline of one of my study Bibles that I'm going to use here amidst so many confusing and sometimes contradictory things that are said about chapter 12, 1 through 13. I mean, believe me, you hadn't seen so much stuff on 13 little verses, and some of it just makes no sense whatsoever. I'm going to go off a little outline I found that does make sense to me, and I think is good. So here we go. We can get this going. First of all, there's a double affirmation of unparalleled distress and assured deliverance here in these first couple of verses of chapter 12. There's good news and bad news. The bad news is God's faithful are not going to be spared hard times. That's the bad news. The good news is they're going to be strengthened and enabled to make it through the struggles and the trials if they maintain the faith. Now, we've already seen this is a truism throughout Daniel already, haven't we? Daniel chapter 3, the faithful are not immune to trials. They're going to undergo suffering. Don't you know, they were on the verge of, I would be, on the verge of having heart attacks, the three friends being thrown before they're thrown into the fiery furnace, they're just begging God, if there's a way out of this, if there's a plan B, let's find it, God. You got to find it quick. I think there was a lot of praying going on. Personally, that would be for me, okay? Maybe my faith's not strong enough. Maybe you would say you'd be resigned to it and just go on. But I would be praying like nobody's business, and in very much distress. So there's never a guarantee that the faithful are going to be immune to suffering. It's just going to happen. We talked about that Sunday. It is going to happen. Mark it down. But the good news is God is with us through the struggle, right? God is always with us through the struggle. He has never left us. He said, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you in any and all circumstances. That brings us to the second one. They are a helped, I already had that there. They are a helped people. Who's helping them? Here we come back to some kind of a la chapter 10, some spiritual warfare, right? Kind of like when Elisha says to his servant, or prays about his servant, Lord, open his eyes so he can see reality, right? Daniel kind of says, open the eyes of those who are going to be dealing with tough things and let them understand that those who are for us are a lot more than those who are against us, right? They're innumerable host, spiritual forces of good that are God's agents that are aligned in realms we can't see against the spiritual forces of evil. And they are overwhelming in their forces. So we come back to Michael, who, like I say, we introduced in chapter 10. He is the prince of their people, your people, talking about the Jews in this case specifically, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. Now, so they are a helped people. God wanted to pass the word through Daniel that God's faithful are not alone. They had on their side innumerable forces led by Prince Michael, who's fighting the spiritual forces of evil. Okay, now the one I was going to mention. They're a helped people. Secondly, they are a known people. What did Paul say to Timothy? God knows those who are His, right? They're not a secret to Him. They are treasured and greatly valued by Him. Jesus told the disciples, Luke 10, verse 20, rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Remember, He sent them out on the commission. They did all this great stuff, and they came and were so excited about all that they were given to be able to do. And He said, don't worry about that stuff. Rejoice in the fact that your name is in the book. Your names are written in heaven. And so He mentions a book here. Verse 2. At that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. I think He's gone beyond just your people, as in Jews. I think it's your people, as in all those who are aligned with God. Don't you think? All those who are on the side of faith and trust in the Lord are those who are going to be found in that book. Look at, I'll look at it for you. Wanted to look at a couple references here. Exodus 32. Just had this not too long ago in our reading. 32, isn't it? 32 and 33. If I can find it and read it. But now please forgive their sin. Of course, Moses pleading on the people's behalf, as he always was. But if not, blot me out of the book that you have written. So already there's this concept early on of the book in which the names of the faithful are written. The Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I'll blot out of my book. So Moses was not there. Let's see. Psalm 69 is another one. You may already be ahead of me there. Psalm 69. And I believe it's verse 28. Oh, yeah. In context, this is a cry of distress in trouble. We may have to suffer severely for our devotion to God, but that should cause us to look forward with joy to the day when evil and injustice will be done forever. This is credited to David. Well, that theme sounds a lot like it matches with what's going on in Daniel, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like that. Talks about the unfaithful there. Those whose wrath, God's wrath is toward them. Let there be no one to dwell in their tents. They persecute those you wound. Talk about the pain of those you hurt. Charge them with crime upon crime. Do not let them share in your salvation. May they be blotted out of the book of life and not be listed with the righteous. So another concept of that list or that book. And there's some other cross references to that. Down here in my little note, also Philippians 4:3, Revelation 3:5. Of course, that's the reference to the book of life. Revelation 13:8, 20 verse 15. So a lot of places we read about the book. So they are a known people. Those who will struggle, who are who are despised or looked down on in this life as being worthless, as being meaningless. They're not without meaning and value to God. He knows and treasures them. So that's important. Chapter 12 is also used to say that God's people will be a vindicated people. A vindicated people with the fullest conception, we've said this, of the afterlife anywhere in the Old Testament. With the most specific language. Any other references we've had have been kind of veiled, have been general. This is very specific. So I think that's significant here. Who's going to be victorious? There's someone who was mentioned in chapter 11 as being significant in a time of trouble, in a time of peril. Do you remember who they were? Look back to 11:32 and 3. The victorious ones are going to be the wise ones, right? The wise, the ones who understand. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Some translations pointed out better that that's the root word that is wise here in verse 33 for understand, the ones with understanding. They know him. They know their God. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they'll fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. Some of the wise, verse 35, will stumble, so they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. We're going to read that thought again here in verse 10, aren't we? Many will be purified, made spotless, and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. What else is new, right? None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. There's that term again. These are the ones who will be the victors. Most believe that in verse 4, Daniel is told, and this actually concludes the vision, by the way, of chapter that starts in chapter 11:1 and goes through verse 4. That basically he's told, you've been given all you need to know. Okay? You've been given all the information you need. Close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. That's not always a good thing. They're looking in all the wrong places for knowledge. But I like that designation. Those who are wise, verse 3, will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So there's a parallelism there. Sounds a lot like a proverb or one of the Psalms, words from some of the Psalms, that there's the equation there of the wise with those who lead many to righteousness. So those are going to shine forth. So another way of saying God knows those who belong to him. So inquiring minds want to know. Daniel asks a lot of questions, but he's basically told here, you're given all you need to know. You don't need to know the answer to every question. So verse 5 through 13 forms sort of an epilogue, sort of an afterword to Daniel. The vision is over, and even though it's still on the same subject, and Daniel asks another one of his questions, and he is told a short time. Now, some scholars take this to be 3.5 years. I'll come back to that in a second. That's the reference to the now where'd it go? Time, times, and half a time. Now my little note says, or a year, 2 years, and half a year. Okay, same difference, 3.5 years. Now, regardless of what that's all about, it will be a time, this is the part that's not a question, it'll be a time when faithfulness will come at intense cost, right? It will be costly to be a believer. It'll be costly to be faithful to God, because there'll be all kind of enticements, whether pain or temptations, whatever else might draw you away. There'll be enticements to do that, to not keep the faith. And we know that in the early days of church, that's why someone like a Polycarp, for example, who was a disciple of John, the Apostle John, said to be, why he was allowed himself to be burned at the stake, he kind of stood out because a lot of people, when the screws were put to them, confess that Caesar's Lord, Caesar's God, they went ahead and did that because they knew what was going to happen if they didn't. A lot of people did recant. A lot of people did turn away from God. So those who don't do that stand out. And that's significant. One thought here is when the saints, this is verse, still in that same verse as the time reference, when the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed. And I like this thought, so I put it up here. The thought of some was when these just are totally lacking in any, understand they're lacking in any power in and of themselves. They're at their most vulnerable. They're at their lowest point. In other words, just can't hold out any longer. That's when their struggle will come to an end. That's verse 4 there. Or I'm sorry, that's not right. Verse 7. I'm sorry, I really have trouble. If I want to see people and see the screen, I got to have my contact in, and if I want to read, I always have it out. So, kind of hard to do both. Okay. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense to me. When their power is totally broken, these things will be completed. I heard, but I didn't understand. Join the club, Daniel. So I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? Kind of told the same thing again, didn't he? You're not going to be given the answer to every question. Go your way. Kind of like Peter there in John chapter, 20 or 21, asking the Lord about John. Because Jesus makes a reference about he may be here longer than you. He says, what about him? You mind your business, right? I'll take care of him. You just do what you're told to do. You do what you're supposed to do. I kind of feel like that's kind of what Daniel's getting here. So here's the reason again for all this happening to the godly, the saints, purifying. They'll be found spotless, refined, and so forth. That's why we have these Red Sea moments, right? That's why we have these. We're put in these situations that only God can get us out of. And maybe more importantly, only God can help us through these times. Okay, verse 11 and 12, we have references to the number of days, and I think I mentioned we'd come back to those. It's a possibility these days are a reference to the 3.5 years the worship was interrupted by what Antiochus did. By the way, in days, if you've counted it up, and I did, it's not quite 1290, it's almost. It's 1277 is what I got by doing 3.5 years. What did you say, Charles?
Months. There's 30 days. And so 1260 is the number you see in Revelations.
Okay.
And this is like 1260 plus another one. And I'm not sure what the significance of that is.
Yeah, and what I read several places was something about their calendar, the lunar calendar added every month or every so often they added 30 days somehow. You remember that, Andy? So that's how it comes out to be the 1290 days, isn't it? Yeah, the 1290 days. So anyway, maybe the representative, another thought, of the next time the temple would be desecrated, again under Titus of Rome. But I don't know if that lasted that time period. We know the time period of Antiochus episode was about 3.5 years, from 168, to when it was rededicated was 164. This is when the Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus, restored things there after Antiochus. So,
in the time of Nero, there is a sequence of 3.5 years that's amazing. Depending on which historian you refer to, everybody has different. Some say no, it's just 2.5 years, and others say no, it's 3.5. But it could be. Again, we see a lot of these scriptures, and we say, oh, it's clearly Antiochus, and then we say, oh, isn't that interesting? What a shadow that is. It's like the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, and then maybe it's also like the time at the very end when, if you believe in the Antichrist thing,
right?
Yeah, that's what a lot of people say. So,
right,
but
so we have options there.
I'll just mention that, Lord willing, I was hoping to be able to lead a class. Something I've mentioned it to you before. I've been studying a lot on not only Daniel, but not Revelations per se, but certainly a lot of Revelation, and what I would call the end times, or the eschatology, all that kind of stuff. And if I'm allowed to do that, if that works out, to teach a class on that, one of the classes will probably be talking about just that issue. This 3.5 years, 1,260 days. Does it even mean? Is it literal? What else could it mean? How does that fit in history? And there's lots of smart scholars over the centuries that have spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. So there's, I don't sit down and figure it out, but I could at least show what others have said. But there's just a lot of fascinating things about the end times, and so I'm hoping to be able to do that, and I'd be looking at, if I do, I'd be looking at a lot of these numbers. Just the whole thing about numbers in Revelation, for example, in the Bible in itself is fascinating. 3.5 is half of 7, right? It's like a broken 7.
Half of the complete number.
And you can read meaning into that, and it's just a lot of cool stuff.
Well, and then the other piece to this is, when you're reading apocalyptic language, numerology is huge in that, but because of the kind of language it is, literature it is, are we even expected to say, here's a one-to-one comparison of what we're talking about? I don't know that we are.
Coming up here tonight, I was I was playing roulette on my radio, AM channels, and I heard this guy. I've heard him before, and he was talking about the end times, and he was talking about some of these numbers, and he was like literal, so literal it was ridiculous. But that fascinates people. I mean, of course, he was making it today.
Yeah, sure.
And when a third of the stars fall from heaven, there's going to be 33 1/3% of the light is going to dim.
Yeah.
I mean, he was convinced that is exactly the way it's going to happen, and people just go nuts with this numerology.
Exactly.
And that leads me to, speaking of numbers, that leads me to this. The main significance of the next number, which is 1335, most scholars will say is simply that it's longer than 1290, which that's obvious. And so the idea being, if you've lasted in the faith, if you hang on, if you've held out through the 1290 and made it to the 1335, then you've pushed through. You've pushed beyond the time of trouble. See? So that's enough on numerology. So the last thing is, Daniel's told, he's going to stay around a little longer. We've said he's roughly, 86, 87 at this time, probably upper 80s. He's going to stay around a little longer, and he's going to be vindicated one day, finally, with the rest of us in the general resurrection. I believe, whatever you want to take about this, take or leave it, but I'm going to throw it out there. I think he's definitely talking about the very end here, when we'll all be together before the Lord. So you'll rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. So he is another, for sure, I don't have to doubt about that, who's going to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," because he certainly was. He certainly exhibited that. Exhibit number A, Daniel, of someone who can not only survive but thrive in Babylon through a period of suffering and change, and all that he dealt with through his entire, if you want to call it career, whatever, his entire adult life. Okay, so we've only got, what is this? This is the 10th. We've only got 2 more Wednesdays, I think, right? So we're going to just kind of go over some more implications for us today for the 21st century about Daniel and some of its lasting value, and then we'll let Daniel go. So, thank y'all.